Some houses become famous because of the people who lived inside them, right? John Lennon's, for instance, Others become famous because of what people claim happened there. What's normally grisly, murder, stuff like that. But every now and then a house earns a reputation so terrifying that decades later people still drive past it just to get a glimpse. This is one of those houses, tucked away on an ordinary residential street in Bridgeport, Connecticut, sits a small 3-room home on Lindley Street. There's nothing remarkable about it. No towering Gothic architecture, no abandoned graveyard next door, no dark forest swallowing it whole. This wasn't made for Hollywood. If you drive past it today, you'll probably never give it a second look. Yet during the winter of 1974, that ordinary little house became the centre of one of the most extraordinary paranormal investigations ever recorded. Not because one person claimed to see a ghost, not because someone heard strange footsteps in the night, but because police officers, firefighters, priests, neighbours, journalists, and paranormal investigators all claim they witnessed something impossible. Heavy furniture moved across the room without anyone touching it. Kitchen tables flipped over, televisions crashed to the floor, refrigerators shifted by themselves, and knives flew through the air. And somewhere inside that tiny house, something appeared determined to make itself presence known. And even stranger, many of the witnesses involved had absolutely nothing to gain. What's important? They weren't ghost hunters chasing fame. They weren't on telly like you get today. They were police officers answering what they believed was a routine disturbance call. Now, some of these officers would later admit that they saw things they simply couldn't explain. Others would not talk about it. A few never wanted to step inside that house ever again. The story quickly spread across America, and within days, thousands of people were gathering outside the property, desperate to witness something for themselves. Television crews arrived, radio stations broadcast updates almost hourly. Reporters surrounded the street, and before long, the tiny home on Lindley Street had become known across the country as America's most haunted house. But here's where the story gets even stranger. Just as quickly as the case exploded into the headlines, it was declared a hoax. The official explanation was simple. A 10-year-old girl named Marcia Goodin had supposedly been responsible for everything. Case closed. Or was it? Because not everyone accepted that explanation. Several officers who had been inside the house later admitted that they never believed a child could have caused what they witnessed. Some insisted objects moved while Marcy wasn't even in the room. Others described seeing several things happen at exactly the same time. One firefighter would later say something that would still send chills down the spine. He said, "They can't convince me it was her." Those words would echo through the years, because if it wasn't Marcia, then what was inside the house? To understand how an ordinary family becomes trapped inside one of the most infamous haunted cases in American history, we need to go back several years before the newspapers, before the crowds, before Ed and Lorraine Warren ever arrived, back to when the Goodin family believed they were beginning a new chapter in their lives. They had no idea they were about to invite something else into their home. So every haunting has a beginning. Not the moment the world hears about it, but the moment something first changes, right? For the Goodin family, that moment didn't come from crashing furniture or ghostly apparitions. It arrived quietly. So quietly, at first, nobody realised anything was wrong. So Jerry and Laura Goodin were an ordinary working couple living in a modest home on Lindley Street, Bridgeport, Connecticut. Life hadn't always been kind to them. In fact, it sucked. Only a few years earlier, they had endured every parent's worst nightmare. Their young son, born with cerebral palsy, tragically passed away. The loss devastated the family. Friends later described Jerry and Laura as people simply trying to carry on and doing their best to rebuild their lives after unimaginable heartbreak. In 1968, they made a decision that filled the house with hope once again. They adopted a little girl from Canada, and her name was Marcia. By all accounts, she was a bright child, quiet, thoughtful, intelligent beyond her years. She was also of Native American heritage, something that would later become a curious footnote in one of the strangest stories ever told. For a while, life appeared perfectly normal, or at least that's how it seemed on the surface. Then little things began happening. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would call paranormal. Objects would disappear. Keys left on a table will be found in another room. Kitchen utensils turned up in strange places. Clothes folded neatly one evening somehow ended up scattered across the bedroom floor. Okay, so weird. Every family loses things and every house makes strange noises, so the Goodins ignored it. But the incidents refused to stop. Instead, they became stranger. And one afternoon, Marcia was sitting on the family sofa with her friend Rosemary. The girls were talking, laughing, enjoying another day, as you do, when the sofa began to vibrate beneath them. Now, at first, they thought someone was playing a prank, but there was nobody else in the room. Then the moment became stronger. According to both girls, the sofa actually lifted from the floor. Now, not enough to throw them across the room, of course, but enough for two children to know that they had experienced something impossible. So the adults struggled to explain it away. Maybe uneven floorboards, someone said. Maybe someone had imagined it. Children can exaggerate, so life carried on. Yet Rosemary would later witness something even stranger. One afternoon, she walked into Marcia's bedroom expecting to find her playing. Instead, she stopped dead in the doorway. Apparently, Marcia was sitting cross-legged on the floor. Her eyes were closed. She was rocking backwards and forwards, and she was speaking. She wasn't speaking English. Nothing anything Rosemary recognised. The words flowed almost rhythmically, like a conversation. For several moments, Rosemary simply watched. Then she quietly asked, "Who are you talking to?" Marcia slowly opened her eyes, and without showing any fear, she calmly replied, "My granddad, my grandfather." Well, the answer made little sense, to be honest, because her grandfather had already died. Rosemary nervously asked what he wanted. So Marcia looked back towards the floor and said, then she said quietly, said something that would stay with her friend for years, apparently. She said, "He's angry." Now, according to Marcia, her grandfather had been a respected chef, and he was unhappy that she'd been adopted, unhappy that she'd left her family behind. Rosemary didn't know what to say. She simply backed out of the room. Later, she would tell people this wasn't a one-off conversation. It happened several times, whether Marcia was grieving, imagining things, or speaking to something none of us can explain. No one knows. But looking back after everything that followed, many investigators would wonder whether these moments were the first warning signs. So the years passed. Apparently, the atmosphere inside the Goodin house seemed to change. It wasn't just the family who noticed. Visitors often commented the home felt unnaturally heavy, difficult to explain, almost as though the air itself had become thicker. Then, during the autumn of 1971, the house found its voice. Late one evening, a loud bang echoed through the walls. Then another. Then another. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't next door. It wasn't on the roof. It seemed to come from inside the house itself. Jerry later described it as sounding like someone was throwing large stones directly at the walls. It went boom, 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 and the rhythm never made sense. Sometimes it happened during breakfast. sometimes in the middle of the afternoon, and sometimes it woke the family in the early hours of the morning. Every room seemed capable of producing the noise. One night it came from the kitchen, the next from the bedroom, then the next the hallway, then directly beneath their feet. The family searched everywhere. Nothing. Neighbours searched, nothing. Eventually, Jerry contacted the police. Not because he believed the house was haunted, but because he genuinely thought someone must be tormenting them. So the officers searched the property. They searched outside. They searched neighbouring gardens. They even considered nearby construction work. Every logical explanation failed. Then one of the officers suggested something unusual. He said, if you hear it again, record it. And the Goodins did exactly that. And when they played the tape back, the knocking could clearly be heard. But even stranger, it appeared to move from room to room, almost as though whatever was making the sound was walking through the house. The recording proved one thing: the noise was real, right? But it answered none of the questions. In fact, it only created more. Because over the next 3 years, the knocker never truly went away. It simply waited, growing louder, growing bolder, as though something inside the house was slowly gathering strength. And before long, it would stop knocking and start throwing things. Now, for almost 3 years, the knocking came and went. Sometimes it disappeared for weeks. Other times it echoed through the walls for hours. The Goodins learned to live with it, or perhaps they simply convinced themselves that they had no other choice. Friends suggested it might be old plumbing. Neighbours blamed nearby construction work. Police officers searched the property more than once. Nobody found anything. Nobody. Eventually, the knocking became part of everyday life. But then everything changed. By the summer of 74, the family began reporting incidents that no amount of logic could explain. One evening, Jerry and Laura were sitting quietly inside their home when movement caught Jerry's eye. So he looked towards the front window and froze. A hand, a pale hand, appeared to press itself against the glass from the outside. It was only there for a second, long enough for both Jerry and Laura to see it. So Jerry jumped to his feet. He rushed to the front door, expecting to catch whoever had been playing tricks on them. He threw the door open. Silence. The street was empty. No footsteps either. No running figure. No neighbour laughing at a prank. There wasn't another soul outside. The couple searched around the house. Nothing. No one. They tried convincing themselves it had been a trick of the light, a reflection, anything but what it appeared to be. And we all do that. A few weeks later, it happened again. 3 loud knocks echoed through the front door. Not frantic knocking, not banging, just 3 deliberate, heavy, perfectly spaced knocks. Laura immediately opened the door. Nobody. Again. Nothing. Nobody. But this time, there was something impossible left behind. Wet footprints. Clear footprints stood on the doorstep, yet the evening had been completely dry. No rain, no puddles, no damp grass. Just these strange footprints appearing from nowhere and disappearing just as mysteriously. Now, where did these footprints come from? It wasn't raining. There shouldn't have been any. By now, the family could no longer laugh the incidents away. The atmosphere inside the house had changed. Doors opened by themselves. Cupboards were found standing open. Furniture shifted ever so slightly overnight. Nothing violent, not yet, just subtle, just enough to make everyone glance over their shoulder. Then came November, the month that would change everything. It began with what seemed like another ordinary evening. The Goodins were enjoying dinner with their neighbours. Conversation flowed easily. For a little while, the strange happenings seemed to almost be forgotten. Then, crash! The sound exploded through the house. Everyone leapt to their feet. The noise had come from one of the bedrooms. Jerry reached the room first. The bedroom window had shattered. Glass covered the floor. At first, everyone assumed someone had thrown a stone through the glass. But when they looked closer, something wasn't right. Most of the broken glass lay outside the house. The window hadn't been smashed from outside. It had exploded from the inside. No one could explain how. The following evening, things became even stranger. After dinner, the family settled into the living room to watch telly. The house felt unnaturally quiet, too quiet. Then another crash echoed through Marcia's bedroom. When Laura opened the door, the curtains had been ripped from the wall. The window blind had been rolled itself completely to the top. She sighed, picked everything up and hung the curtains back into place, pulled the blind down and turned to leave. Before she reached the doorway, the curtains tore themselves free again. The blind shot back upwards. No one had touched them. Nobody was near the window, and for several long seconds, nobody spoke. Jerry simply stared. Laura looked at him. Neither could think of a single explanation, and eventually they walked away. Now, I know you think, how can you walk away? But what else do you do? Sometimes ignoring strange things felt easier than trying to understand them. So they went back to the living room. The silence returned. Then a loud boom, another boom, another boom. The knocking was back, only this time it wasn't confined to one room. The walls shook, the ceilings vibrated, the floor beneath their feet trembled with each deafening impact. It sounded as though something enormous was trapped inside the walls trying to break free. The noise grew louder and louder until conversation became impossible. Even the television was drowned out. And then without warning, everything stopped. Complete silence. No footsteps. No voices. No explanation. The family barely slept that night. Something had changed. Look, if I was the neighbours, I wouldn't have stayed there. In fact, if I was the neighbours, I wouldn't have gone over there, right? Every one of them knew it. Something had changed deep down. Whatever had been making noises inside the house for years no longer seemed content with just knocking. It wanted to be seen. The following afternoon, the Goodins returned home after visiting relatives. Jerry unlocked the front door, and at first, nothing looked unusual. Then he noticed Marcia's television. Now, it should have been sitting safely on a high shelf. Instead, it was laying face down across her bed. The wires dangled over the edge like someone had deliberately placed it there. Now, frowning, Jerry lifted it back into position. He hadn't taken more than a few steps towards the kitchen when he heard porcelain clatter behind him. He turned around. A dinner plate rose out of the kitchen sink. Not thrown, not bounced, it simply lifted. For a split second, it hung in the air. Then it shot across the room, smashing into the wall. Another plate followed, then another. Within seconds, cups started flying, bowls started flying, glasses were flying through the kitchen as though invisible hands were emptying every cupboard at once. Jerry just stood there frozen, unable to believe what he was seeing. Then something happened that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And this is dodgy. The knife block sitting on the kitchen counter suddenly shook. One knife slowly slid upwards, then another, and without warning, the knives launched themselves across the room. Now, Jerry instinctively threw himself to the floor as the blades buried themselves into the cupboard and walls behind him. And that is extremely dangerous, isn't it? Obviously. Laura reached the doorway just in time to see the final knife strike the wall. And neither of them spoke because there was no words left. And what happened next would convince the Goodins that whatever was inside their home was no longer simply trying to frighten them, it was becoming violent. By now, the Goodin family were exhausted. For years, they had lived with strange knocks, moving objects, and a feeling that something unseen shared their home. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared them for what happened next. The house was no longer playing tricks, it was attacking them. Now, after the terrifying incident with the flying plates and knives, an uneasy silence settled over the kitchen. You can just imagine it, can't you? You're sitting there in shock and you've got remnants of broken things just going ding, 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 ding. Jerry slowly stood from the floor. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Laura remained frozen in the doorway. Neither of them dared speak. Every instinct told them to leave the house. But this was their home. Everything they owned was inside. Trying to convince themselves the worst was over, they cautiously began putting things back where they belonged. Broken crockery was slept into piles. The knives were picked up one by one. The television was returned to its shelf once again. And for a few precious moments, nothing happened. Then Laura carried a bag of groceries into the kitchen, and as she unpacked the food, she heard a scraping sound behind her. At first she ignored it. The noise came again, slow, heavy, like furniture being dragged across the floor. She turned around, and what she saw stole the breath from her lungs. The kitchen table was moving. Not sliding, not wobbling, not delicately, lifting. One side rose slowly into the air as though an enormous, invisible hand had reached under it. Laura stood rooted to the spot. The table climbed higher and higher until suddenly it flipped completely over. Groceries exploded across the floor, glass jars shattered, food scattered across the floor. The table crashed down with such force the entire house shook. Before Laura could even react, another sound filled the kitchen, a deep metallic groan. She turned once more. This time, the refrigerator was moving.